pie was still warm. That was the first thing Inspector Doyle Hatch noticed when he arrived at Stall 7 on that October morning. The crust was golden, the steam still rising in thin threads into the cold air, as though someone had placed it there moments before he arrived. On top of it, a folded piece of paper. No words, just his name, written in small, precise letters, in the handwriting of a woman who had spent 30 years making sure every single thing she produced was exactly as she intended. The stall was empty, the market square was silent. And Mabel Crowe, the woman who had fed this village for 3 decades without anyone daring to ask what exactly they were eating, was gone. You think you know how this ends? You don't, because the real question, the one that will follow you after this video is over, isn't where Mabel Crowe went. It's whether she was a monster, or the only honest form of justice this village ever produced. Stay with me, because this story goes much deeper than a pie. Before we go further, you need to understand something about the world in which this story takes place. Because without that understanding, Mabel Crowe is just a villain. And she is not just a villain. We are in England, 1887. A village called Ashbourne Hollow, buried in the countryside like a secret someone decided not to finish keeping. Population, 412 souls according to the last census. 413, if you count the woman at stall 7, though many people in this town, for reasons that will become clear, preferred not to count her at all. This is the era of the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, a law that, for the first time in English history, allowed a woman to own property independently of her husband. Before that act, everything a woman owned, her savings, her business, her tools, her name, legally belonged to her husband the moment she married him. Think about that for a moment. You could spend 20 years building something with your own hands, and the law would look you in the eyes and tell you it belonged to the man sleeping in your house. The man who might be drinking your earnings. The man who might be raising his fist every time the door closed. The law had a name for this arrangement. It called it marriage. Mabel Crowe called it something else. But she never used words for it. She used flour, and a stone oven, and an ingredient that no one in Ashbourne Hollow was brave enough to ask about. And this is where our story truly begins. Every Tuesday and Friday, the market square of Ashbourne Hollow filled with the commerce of survival. Vegetables, fabrics, tools, promises. The kind of market that smells like wet stone and horse in the particular desperation of people who cannot afford to have a bad week. And in the far corner of that square, always already assembled before anyone else arrived, always already open before the fog had fully lifted. Stall 7. The pies at Stall 7 were not simply good. The word good does not contain them. They were the kind of thing that made people stop mid-sentence, mid-thought, mid-step, as though the aroma had reached into their chests and adjusted something. Can you imagine a smell so specific it feels like a memory? Not your memory, someone else's. A memory you were never supposed to have access to. That was what people in Ashbourne Hollow described, in the rare moments when they tried to describe it at all. A retired governess named Mrs. Harwick said it was like tasting a feeling she could not name. A local farmer said the filling reminded him of meat, but meat from something he had never hunted. A visiting clergyman ate an entire slice before he realized what he was doing, and said only that it was the kind of thing a man should eat once in his life and never again. No one asked what was in them. Not really. Not with the insistence a question like that deserves. Because the woman behind the counter, Mabel Crowe, the widow, 60 years old and not a single day of those years easy, had a way of receiving questions that made them feel impolite. Not through coldness, not through hostility, through something more precise. An absolute and unhurried stillness that suggested she had already answered this question, in her own mind, long before you arrived to ask it. Her hands were white with flour. Her eyes were the color of old pewter, not gray, not green, not blue, but the color of something that was once valuable and had simply stopped needing to prove it. She did not smile. Not ever. Not because she was sad. Not because she was cruel. But because she had learned, 11 years of learning to be exact, not to offer her face to the world as a gift it had not earned. And the men who made trouble for Mabel Crowe? They disappeared. Not violently, not in ways that demanded investigation. In the quiet, inexorable way of things that simply stop occurring, like a sound you realize you haven't heard in months and cannot remember when it stopped. A debt collector, a landowner, a man who lied under oath in her direction. Gone, 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 each with a different explanation, each explanation accepted without much scrutiny, the way a town accepts what it has already decided it wants to believe. But here is the question that no one in Ashbourne Hollow was asking, the question that a young journalist from London would arrive to ask, without knowing yet that asking it would cost her more than any story she had ever written. If the pies were that perfect, what, precisely, made them so? If you're the kind of person who believes the world keeps secrets that most people are too comfortable to face, you've found your place here. Don't let this story disappear into the algorithm. Subscribe now to keep these voices from the past alive. Leave a like if you believe the truth is stranger than any fiction, and comment, "I'm here," so I know you made it this far with me. Now, back to Ashbourne Hollow. Ilara Voss arrived in Ashbourne Hollow on a Tuesday in October 1887, sent by her London newspaper to write what her editor had called, and I want you to feel the distance between these words and what she actually found, a charming piece about rural market culture. She was 28 years old, ink-stained fingers, a leather notebook she treated with more care than most people treat other people, a reputation for being difficult, which, in 1887, was the word used for women who asked the right questions at the wrong time. She was not difficult, she was accurate. And accuracy, in a town built on comfortable silence, is the most dangerous quality a visitor can bring. The first thing she noticed was the queue at stall 7. The second was the aroma. The third was the woman behind the counter. And this is where the author needs to step in for a moment, because what happened next is not just a narrative detail. It is a psychological event worth examining. There is a phenomenon that criminologists and behavioral psychologists refer to as social normalization of the extraordinary, the human tendency to incorporate deeply abnormal elements into the background of daily life simply because they are consistent and familiar. The people of Ashbourne Hollow had not stopped noticing Mabel Crowe. They had simply filed her, and everything about her, into a category marked acceptable without ever examining what that acceptance contained. Ilara Voss did not have that file. She was seeing stall 7 for the first time, with eyes that had not yet learned what they were supposed to ignore. She finished the entire pie before she had taken 4 more steps. And then she opened her notebook, not to write about the market, not to write about the charm of rural England, but to write questions. Specific, uncomfortable, investigative questions. What is in the filling? How long has this stall been here? Where is the husband? Why does everyone speak of her the way people speak of weather, as a given, as a force, as something that simply exists and cannot be addressed? Can you imagine being in that market square, tasting something extraordinary, feeling the wrongness of it and the rightness of it simultaneously, your journalist's instinct and your human hunger pulling in opposite directions? An elderly preserves vendor named Dorota confirmed what the records would later corroborate. Mabel had arrived as the wife of Edmund Crowe, a butcher. Edmund had disappeared 15 years ago in March. The town said he had gone north with another woman. Dorota said this without looking at Ilara. She said it in the particular tone of a fact that everyone has agreed to treat as a fact regardless of whether it is one. And then, and this is the detail I need you to hold on to, she added, almost quietly, almost to herself. The pies got better after he left. But what Ilara didn't know yet, what none of us know when we pull on a thread, is that the thread doesn't lead to a single answer. It leads to a room. And in that room, there is a ledger. And in that ledger, there are margins. And in those margins, there is a cipher. And the cipher, once decoded, cannot be undecoded. Silas Moore had been the caretaker of Ashbourne Hollow Market for 31 years. His hair had gone completely white at the age of 42. Overnight, he said. In a single night. He never explained why. He was the kind of man who knows everything about a place and says nothing, not because he lacks the courage exactly, but because he has lived long enough to understand that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again from the outside. Ilara found him on a Thursday afternoon and offered him gin. This was not a casual gesture. This was a journalist doing what journalists do, identifying the precise currency that unlocks a specific person. The currency for Silas Moore was gin, and the permission to say something out loud that he had been carrying in silence for 3 decades. He told her about Mabel Crowe, and here is where the author must again intervene, because this is not simply backstory. This is the entire architecture of what happened, and it deserves to be understood with the precision it was lived. Mabel Crowe was a butcher by trade, and a particular kind of man by nature, the kind that a community recognizes as dangerous and nonetheless protects, because the alternative is to acknowledge that the community itself enabled the danger. He drank, he accumulated debts, and shed them through legal maneuvering, and the loyalty of men who benefited from the same system he exploited, and he beat Mabel Crowe for 11 years. In 1887 England, domestic violence was not a crime in any practically enforceable sense. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1878 had technically allowed women to seek separation on grounds of assault, but the burden of proof was immense. The magistrates were men, and the social consequence of a woman appearing before a court was, in many communities, more damaging than the violence she was trying to escape. Mabel had tried. Silas confirmed this. She had filed formal complaints with the local magistrate on 3 separate occasions. 3 times the paperwork was received. 3 times the outcome was the same. Nothing. And then, in March of a year, Silas preferred not to specify, Mabel Crowe disappeared. A Thursday. The market was open as normal. Mabel was at her stall, as always. Edmund was never seen again. And the following Tuesday, Silas said, the pies changed. Then Silas said something that Ilara would transcribe in her notebook, underline twice, and never include in any published article. Have you ever wondered why her filling is always so dark? He looked up then, just briefly, just long enough. And he added, and I need you to hear the full weight of this sentence. I still buy one every Saturday. 30 years. I've tried to stop. He paused. I can't. What does it mean that the man who suspects what those pies contain keeps buying them? What does that tell us about the nature of complicity, and about our own willingness to accept extraordinary things if they come wrapped in something beautiful enough? That question is going to stay with you. I promise you that. But the story isn't done, because there was still the ledger, and there was still the cottage, and there was still one night in October when Ilara Voss pulled at a thread that had no comfortable ending. Agnes Fell sold medicinal herbs from the stall immediately beside stall 7. She had done so for 22 years. She had earth under her fingernails that never fully came out, and a way of speaking that moved around the truth the way a river moves around stone, always in motion, always arriving somewhere, never quite direct. She was the only person in that market who brought Mabel something every week. Fresh thyme. Every Monday morning, without fail, for over 2 decades. You need to understand what that means in context. In a village where everyone bought from Mabel and no one stood beside her, Agnes Fell stood beside her, not out of ignorance, not out of naivety. Agnes Fell is one of the most psychologically complex figures in this story, and she is almost always overlooked in favor of the more dramatic characters. But consider her position. A woman of 50 in Victorian rural England, living adjacent, literally physically adjacent, to something she almost certainly understood. Choosing, week after week, to bring time. Choosing, week after week, to say nothing. Is she complicit? By legal definition, possibly. By moral definition, that is a question this video will not answer for you. That is a question you will have to sit with. When Ilara asked Agnes whether she knew what was inside the pies, Agnes was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "There are things a woman can know without being obligated to speak about them." She paused. There is a difference between complicity and understanding. She paused again. I sleep well at night, if that is what you are asking. Alara asked. You sleep? Agnes replied. Like a stone, for 20 years. That night, Alara did not sleep at all. She sat surrounded by the municipal missing persons records she had obtained. 15 years of files, all men, all with some connection to the market, and drew lines between them. Pencil lines on a rough map of the square. Every line ended at the same place. But here is the thing about lines on a map. They only tell you where something is. They don't tell you what it is. For that, Alara was going to need to go somewhere she should not go. Open something she should not open, and read something that, once read, would change the particular texture of every meal she ate for the rest of her life. On the 15th night of her stay in Ashbourne Hollow, Alara Voss committed an act that no journalism ethics board would sanction, and that I suspect every single person watching this video would have done in her position. She entered Mabel's storage cottage. The vestiges of warmth from the stone oven were still present, a sepulchral heat, the kind that lingers long after its source has gone to bed. The shelves held unlabeled jars of dark liquid. The walls held utensils arranged with the obsessive precision of a woman who had spent decades perfecting a craft. And on a high shelf, behind a row of vinegar jars, half hidden in shadow, a ledger, bound in dark leather. Can you picture yourself in that room? The smell of smoke and something older underneath it. The warmth that shouldn't still be there. The silence of a building that has absorbed 30 years of a particular kind of work. Alara took the ledger down. It was a recipe book. Each page detailed a pie, the pastry ratios, the temperatures, the oven times. It was a document of extraordinary technical precision. The writing of someone who had refined every variable until each one was exact. But in the margins there were annotations, made in a different ink, in a cipher, simple, almost carelessly so, as though Mabel had not expected anyone to need to decode it. Because why would they? Who would look? Alara decoded it in 11 minutes, and then she stood very still in the middle of that cottage for a period of time she would later be unable to estimate. The margin notes described the primary ingredient of the filling, its origin, the method of preparation, and beside each recipe, a date. The date the ingredient became available. The earliest entry, March 1872, a Thursday, the same month, the same day of the week. The same year that Mabel Crowe disappeared from Ashbourne Hollow and was never seen again. I'll let you sit with that. We are in the deepest part of this story now. The place most channels won't take you because they're afraid of what lives here. If you've made it this far, you're not most people. Subscribe so you never miss when we go this deep again. Like this video, not for the algorithm, but as a signal that you want stories told without flinching. And comment your theory below. Was Mabel Crowe a monster, or the only justice this village ever had? I read every single one. Alara went back the next night. This time Mabel Crowe was there. She had her back turned when Alara entered, folding dough, sealing edges with her thumbs, placing a tin into the oven with the unhurried motion of someone who has performed this sequence so many thousands of times that it has become indistinguishable from breathing. She did not turn immediately. She finished what she was doing first, because Mabel Crowe always finished what she was doing first. She looked at Alara. She looked at the ledger in Alara's hands. And she said, with no inflection, no surprise, no fear. 3 words. You read it. Not a question. What follows is, psychologically, one of the most remarkable things about this case. Mabel Crowe did not deny, did not threaten, did not reach for any of the defenses available to a person in her position. She explained, calmly, methodically, in the same measured voice she used to describe pastry ratios. She said that Edmund Crowe had beaten her for 11 years, that he had stolen her savings 3 times and each time the law had told her the savings were his, that he had lied before the magistrate on 3 separate occasions and walked free because the magistrate was his cousin, that when he had threatened to take the stall, the one thing she had built, the one thing that was entirely and irrevocably hers, She had understood that no institution was going to protect it. She said the law had had 11 years. 11 years of evidence, of neighbors who witnessed and said nothing, of doctors who treated and documented and filed, of a system that looked directly at what was happening and chose again and again to classify it as a domestic matter. The law did precisely nothing. And so Mabel Crowe, in March of 1872 on a Thursday, did something. She did not describe what she did. She did not need to. The ledger had already described it in the language of dates and ingredients and oven temperatures. She said only, "Nothing is wasted." And then she cut a slice of the pie that had just come out of the oven, placed it on a plain white plate, slid it across the work table toward Alara, and waited. Can you imagine that moment? The smell reaching you before you've made any decision. Your body responding to something your mind is frantically trying to categorize. The woman across from you, calm, flour-dusted, pewter-eyed, watching you with the patience of someone who has learned to wait for things. Alara looked at the pie for a long time. She did not eat it. But, and this is the detail that will define everything that comes after, she also said nothing. She left the cottage, walked through the fog of Ashbourne Hollow for 3 hours, and returned to her room to face alone the most difficult question this story asks. When the systems built to deliver justice fail completely, when the law looks the other way, when the courts protect the wrong person, when the only witness is a woman whom the entire infrastructure of her era was designed to make invisible, what is left? And more uncomfortably, what would you have done? Inspector Doyle Hatch was the kind of man that systems produce when they run long enough without accountability. Not corrupt in any dramatic sense, not villainous, not intentionally cruel, just tired. The specific exhaustion of someone who has made a long series of small accommodations with the truth, none of them decisive enough to feel like a choice, all of them accumulated into something that looked, from the outside, a great deal like complicity. He had eaten 3 of Mabel Crowe's pies. The first, on duty, offered by a municipal colleague, accepted without thought. The second, 6 months later, purchased with his own money. The third, 2 years ago, on the very morning he received the first anonymous report about the disappearance of a debt collector with known connections to Stall 7. He had stopped by the market before opening the case file. Now, on an October morning, he stood in front of that empty stall and looked at what had been left for him. 1 pie, 1 piece of paper, his name, in her handwriting. He unfolded the paper, nothing else written, just his name. He stood there for what witnesses in the adjacent stalls would later describe as a considerable time. He did not call for backup. He did not immediately open an investigation. He stood, and he looked at the pie, and he performed, visibly, externally, the arithmetic of a man who knows exactly what the right thing to do is and is counting the cost of doing it. Mabel Crowe was never found. The inquiry was filed. The cottage was documented, immaculate, empty, the shelves bare, the oven cold as though fire had never been its purpose. The ledger was not found because the ledger had left with Mabel, or had never been in any location that Inspector Hatch chose to search. The case remained open for 2 years. Then it was archived. What Hatch did with the pie that morning, whether he ate it, destroyed it, or simply stood there until it went cold, was never recorded in any official document. And this, I want you to understand, is not the anomaly. This is the system working exactly as designed. A woman with no institutional power found a way to balance an equation that the law refused to solve. The law, upon discovering this, found a way to not quite look at it directly. And life in Ashbourne Hollow continued, as it had before, as it would after, in the comfortable fog of things left unexamined. 3 weeks after leaving Ashbourne Hollow, Alara Voss published her article. It was called "The Finest Pies in England." It described the market, the fog, the smell of wet stone on October mornings, the stalls with their peculiar charms. A remarkable woman at stall 7, skilled, silent, singular, who had since moved on. It did not mention the ledger. It did not mention the margins. It did not mention Silas Moore, Agnes Fell, Inspector Hatch, or the missing persons records she had returned to the municipal archive on the morning of her departure. The article ended with one paragraph, and I want to read it to you exactly as she wrote it, because I think it is one of the most precise and devastating pieces of journalism ever published under the guise of a food column. I have tasted many things I cannot explain, and some I cannot forget. There are places that guard the secrets of their people with the same naturalness with which stone holds the warmth of summer long after the sun has gone. Ashbourne Hollow is one of those places, and the pies of Stall 7, whatever the ingredients that made them so singular, were, without the shadow of a doubt, the most extraordinary thing I have ever tasted in my life. She knew. She always knew. And she made a choice. Here is what I want you to consider as we reach the end of this story, not as a conclusion, but as a question you carry out of this video with you. The Victorian era's treatment of domestic violence was not simply a matter of ignorance or cultural backwardness. It was a system, constructed, maintained, and defended by people who understood exactly what they were doing. The Matrimonial Causes Act, the magistrate courts, the property laws, these were not oversights. They were choices, made by people with the power to make different choices. Mabel Crowe did not emerge from a vacuum. She emerged from 30 years of a system telling her, in every language available to a system, that her suffering was invisible and her options were none. Does that make what she did right? No. This video will not tell you it was right. Does it make it comprehensible? Completely. And that comprehensibility, the fact that you can follow the logic of her choices, step by step, from the first complaint filed to the first pie sold, is not a comfortable thing to sit with. Because it means the question is not really about Mabel Crowe. It is about what we build when we build systems that make certain people invisible. The legend, as legends do, outlasted the woman. In 3 different counties, in the years that followed, people began to speak of a woman at a market whose stall always had the longest queue, whose pies were perfect in a way that no recipe could account for, whose neighboring vendors noticed that she arrived before dawn, left after dusk, brought fresh thyme every week, and that men who made trouble for her tended, over time, to stop appearing in those parts. The name changed. The place changed. The dark apron and the high bun and the eyes the color of old pewter remained. What never changed, in any version, in any county, in any telling, was the pie. Always golden. Always steaming. Always carrying that aroma that arrived before everything else, that reached the stomach before it passed through the nose, that made people stop mid-step and turn their heads towards something they could not name and could not quite resist. Always perfect. Always. We walked into the dark together today, and we found something harder than a monster. We found a mirror. Mabel Crowe existed because the world she lived in built the conditions for her. That is the lesson that history hides in its most disturbing corners, and it is the lesson this channel exists to excavate. If these stories matter to you, if you believe the past deserves to be examined without flinching, your subscription is what keeps this work alive. Click subscribe so you're never left in the dark when the next story surfaces. Leave a like as a testament to the search for truth. And share your most unfiltered theory in the comments. Was Mabel a monster, a martyr, or something the English language doesn't quite have a word for yet? I read every comment. I'll be there. The shadows are patient. So are we.